This week, on the Steve and Friends live stream, Richard Murphy joins the chat. Richard is the professor of accounting at Sheffield University Management School, and is a columnist for the national newspaper in Scotland. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Steve and Friends. I'm Ty Keynes. We have a very special episode today. Richard Murphy is in the house. We're going to get to him. We're going to talk to all things economics, some housekeeping. If you're watching on the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel, make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber already. Comment in our little chat box right here beside. I should make a graphic with my finger going up and down so I don't have to do this all the time. Make sure you chat there. We'll try to answer your questions, or just talk to each other, whatever you like. Comment underneath the video. That helps with the algorithm so we get more views every week. So we also, if you're on Twitter, retweet there if you want to, or like there, and then come over here. Now, Steve is sending me a message in the background, and it's kind of throwing me off my game, so I don't know what he means. Do I sound loud, guys? Question to the audience: do I sound loud? I'm gonna bring in Dan because Dan,
hey,
how do I sound right now?
I don't get the double sound issue. I'm not sure what that is, but maybe I don't hear an issue.
Okay, good. I think it's more of a Steve issue. We know he always has technical issues.
I think it's the internet that he subscribes to. I think they always throw him a bit of chaos, right? I mean, we know how he likes complex systems, so they're like, oh, we're gonna screw with this guy. So, he's got a subscription to an internet service, and I don't know who he subscribes to, but every week he's got an issue. So they're like, he's gonna figure it out. If anybody on the planet's gonna figure it out, Steve Keen's gonna figure it out. So let's just kind of mess with him. That's what I think.
I think it's become become the fabric of the show. And Jess Matthew says we sound fine. So Steve, it's definitely an issue on your end. We'll give you a little bit of time to figure that out. Dan, I was gonna get Steve to do the top chatters from last week, but since he's having a few issues, I'm gonna give that job to you. So right. I'll bring that up, and are you ready to read?
Hit me. Throw it at me.
Here we go.
Throw it at me. All right. Miserius, but I think it's a USZ. Tarek Fahim, Botched Mandela, Ghost on a Half Shell, Hugh Jen, Niels Raidmaker, Lost Adult, Lana Dell Hates the Clock. I was going to say the Hasty Ant, but the Hasty Ant, and Joe Polito. Woo!
You did it. And actually, now looking at that graphic, that's a mistake on it is a the. Oh, I do so much shit each week for this show, and I'm a one-man army that I make mistakes. I
should have gestalted it. I mean, the thing is that you just got to go with your gestalt, your gestalt impulse, right? And just let yourself autocomplete. We do it with our when we're writing stuff. I mean, why can't we do it with speech and reading too, right? Live.
I'm going to try to figure out a way if I can just get AI to do all this for me. In fact, there'll just be an AI version of me like you showed a few months ago.
Yeah.
I'll be in
AI right now. I'm not, I'm actually out walking the dog, really.
Let's bring on Mike Radzicki. Mike.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? Ty, I must admit, you're looking handsome today in that outfit, and Dan and I kind of almost have the same kind of shirt on today. I don't know how that happened. We didn't communicate ahead of the show, but good to see everybody.
Yeah, we're
Good.
team plaid. Mike and Dan are team plaid. I just can't. It's just like, the wife takes me shopping, and anywhere that there's a plaid section in the department store, it's like I kind of like gravitate towards it. I don't know what it is.
Can't go wrong with flannel, in my opinion.
Yeah, flannel, plaid. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You guys actually look like a bunch of Canadian loggers.
Wow.
And Mike, I'm proud to announce that you fit in well with Canadians. You're more than welcome up here.
Appreciate it. From Wisconsin, so kind of sort of heading towards Canada a little bit. Yep. I've enjoyed my stays in Canada.
Let's bring on Steve Keen. Well, maybe we'll make him a Canadian as well. Steve?
I'll just comment that I'm looking at a pair of lumberjacks here. And the day that you break into the Monty Python song, I think I can actually help with the chorus. Right. He's a lumberjack and he's okay.
Well, wait a minute. I have to say, we've been trying to get Steve to come to Canada and visit the West Coast, and I think Ty's even offered Steve to stay in his house. And I don't know, does your wife?
No,
is she okay with that? Where's the dog going to sleep?
Yeah, actually, yeah. No, my wife is always looking for a reason to kind of straighten me up. So anybody with a half a brain is welcome into the house. And Steve obviously has an extraordinary brain, you could say. So he's
also extraordinarily messy. So I'm not sure your wife would welcome me all that much. But anyway, we'll see how we go.
Okay, I think it's time to bring on Richard. Richard Murphy, everybody. Here he is.
Hey, Richard.
Wow!
You're in the very small checks, okay?
That's impressive. That is damn impressive.
There's lots of lumberjacks.
We've had
that was pre-recorded. I'm certain.
No, we've had those people on the couch for a long time, and they're always silent. I don't know why they're all of a sudden like something about Richard Murphy just gets them to stand up and clap and cheer, and that's impressive. You carry a lot of weight there, Richard.
Thank you, Dan.
Richard, how you doing, buddy?
I'm all right. Look, it's a great early evening here in East Anglia in England. It's been a great day, the best day of the year so far. I'm relaxed. I'm ready to go. Let's see what we're going to talk about, because I've got no real idea as yet. What are you going to spring on me?
Let's kind of first and foremost, let's get a background on who Richard Murphy is. Tell us how you got in. I know you're a chartered accountant. I know you're definitely a heterodox economist. Tell us the story of that progression through time. How did it start? I'm assuming in university, high school. Give us an idea.
Well, it's a long story. I'm not quite as old as Steve. I'm 5 years behind Steve. But it began in school. I became interested, rather oddly, in transport and railway history. I didn't do that thing of collecting train numbers, the standard teenage boy thing of my youth. Instead, I got really interested in railway history. The history of the railway company was the history of the company itself, was the history of the social development of the UK. And I got completely absorbed into that. And by reading railway history, I got fascinated by accounting. I mean, bizarre thing for a teenager, but that was what drove me to think I'm going to do economics and the social dimension of this, and accounting and how companies are put together and how mergers and acquisitions take place. So I went off to university in 76, 200th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. I celebrated it by studying economics, and by the end of my first term, I thought, let's use a technical term here. This is a crock of shit. Why? Because I've been taught that microeconomic entities were profit maximizers. Now, I knew that my father was not keen on me being an economist. He was an engineer, and everybody numerate in the world had to be an engineer. So I had to basically work my way through university, and I did it from the age of 17, learning how to do accounts. And I worked my way through by basically doing what were called brown paper parcel accounting jobs, little firms, which I would prepare the accounts for a local firm that I knew in my hometown. And from that, I realized these guys hadn't the faintest idea what profit was. profit was nothing like, as far as they were concerned, what economists were talking about. Nobody maximized it. Nobody most certainly knew their marginal costs and their marginal revenues. They put a finger in the air and sort of sucked the air and saw what was happening, or tried it and saw. And therefore, I just thought, I'm being taught rubbish here. And I had a whale of a time doing other things at university, but I did get a pretty good degree. If I'm totally honest, I did put the effort in. In my final exams, it was only examined on the finals, my tutor sent me a note afterwards, because for the first time ever, I wrote essays that were compliant with their requirements. And the note said hypocrite. Because I did exactly what was required to get the degree and then moved on. Look, I thought I might become an economist. I decided to become an accountant. I went off to Pete Marwick. I learned, and I left university with a plan. There was going to be 20 years as an accountant. There were going to be 20 years as an academic. And by now I was going to be retired. Well, I did the 20 years as an accountant. I had a whale of a time. I enjoyed it. I became senior partner of a firm. I did parallel entrepreneurial activity. I've set up and run a lot of companies. I'm unashamed of having made profit. I then decided that was over. I was going to make the change, of course. And instead of becoming an academic, I'd already become a visiting fellow at some universities, and I'd registered for a PhD and not done it. I got involved in campaigning, and through the Tax Justice Network, which I co-founded, and through the Green New Deal, which I helped create, I got heavily absorbed into campaigning. I ended up negotiating with the OECD the 2015 international settlement to tackle companies like Google, Amazon, and Starbucks. All those stories were created by me in some way. And as a result, was invited to become a professor of political economy, because effectively I'd done political economy. I had actually negotiated an international settlement to change the power relationships within international society. So I went to City University, and throughout all that period, I should add, I've been thinking about economics. I mean, I was the accountant to the New Economics Foundation in the UK in the 1980s. I have contributed to its work and thinking, been to conferences, and had developed underpinning all my thinking the whole idea of what is the role of money in the economy, how does tax and money work together, and I've been writing about that for years before anything appeared on paper. What is the intergenerational contract? All sorts of what I thought were big meta questions, which I wasn't getting the answer to anywhere else. And that is where I ended up eventually where I am now, a political economist, clearly heterodox, still an accountant, but overall focusing upon impact on the real world. That to me is the most important thing. How do we take ideas and make them have impact on the real world and make the world a better place by ideas? That's my narrative.
Very, very nice. Yeah, I've known about you about a year now. Here's the thing. I live in a bit of a box when it comes to economics. I kind of follow Steve Keen, and whoever he mentions, I go and I read their papers, and I try to, build up my knowledge. And I've seen you mentioned briefly here and there. And then, of course, recently there's been a bit of a MMT, I wouldn't say, maybe a controversy. So I've started looking into your work a lot more, and like, holy shit, you're the man. I want to kind of get Steve in here. Steve, how did you first hear about Richard Murphy? Have you guys met, or do you just know each other passing on social media? Tell me that story, Steve.
No, we've met. We've a few times, about 3 or 4 times, I think, overall. Not as often as it should be, but like we instantly chime, because I've sort of come to accounting the reverse direction to you, Richard. So I did an arts law degree at university, and in the middle of my first year, I realized I was being taught a crock of shit as well. But I didn't study accounting because I'd done an arts law degree. So my art subject, which is like, for those who don't know the term, it's a generic choose whatever courses you want to do and put them together yourself degree fundamentally. So I did mathematics, economics, psychology, which turned out to be a waste of time in my opinion, and then also legal history and constitutional law and so on as part of my law degree. But the thing you'll quite appreciate is in 1973, I led a student revolt over the teaching of economics at Sydney University. And without a doubt, the best help that I got from both the clerical staff and from the academics was from accounting, because they absolutely delighted in the fact that I was kicking the Economist in the balls. So this is back in the days of Roneo, long before we had photocopies and just you remember Distetner machines?
Yeah, purple ink and all
I
that
am
stuff.
5 years older than you, as you said, so maybe not. So I used the Distetner machine of the accounting department to make my leaflets attacking the economics department. And
you know, accounting is fundamental as a building block, isn't it, Steve? I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
And that double entry idea, you have to understand that there's a reaction for every action. And until you get that, you don't understand externalities. You don't understand what macro is. Micro tends to think there's no reaction. You can't get this whole idea of how the economy hangs as a whole. And I think that's what most economists don't get.
Oh, totally, because they fall for this crap about money illusion in first year. And I remember being taught it. Back when I did first year economics, you went through all the nonsense over indifference curves to derive individual demand curves. We did Slutsky equations and stuff like this in first year in 1971 at Sydney University. Now I see they're taught as advanced topics in third or fourth year. But they lull them with it. Do you remember the shit? Have you read the Mankiw textbook on micro and macro?
No, I know of it.
It's a load of.
I think there's a copy back behind me, but I mean, have I ever read it? No, but I mean, I had to suffer Samuelson, Lipsey, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I did Samuelson, Lipsey as well. Yes. So they were much harder. I mean, even though we're both rubbishing them, and quite justifiably so, they were much tougher textbooks than what they teach these days. But the end result is students get lulled into believing money doesn't matter. So if somebody has an economics degree, money illusion. If you talk about money, you're suffering from money illusion, you must be a moron. I said, no, you're the moron for believing money doesn't matter. So that was my overall framework right from the very beginning. But I didn't get into accounting until I invented godly tables as part of Minsky. And then, first of all, I had single entry in godly tables, because I didn't realize the importance of double entry. So thank you for the dirty face. Okay. And then I finally, double entry was basically forced upon me by the realism of trying to model monetary dynamics. And now my thinking absolutely starts from double entry bookkeeping. And I've also proven, and it's literally mathematically proven, that credit, which is change in debt as part of aggregate demand and income, and that also plays through the godly tables in the accounting system. So if you don't understand accounting, and you therefore don't understand money, and you don't understand capitalism, and yes, Win Godley is the person I named those tables after. So yeah, I've come to appreciate accounting in the reverse direction. And I'm not sure whether I'm happy or not happy that I didn't learn it in the first instance. But I've certainly realized if you don't understand accounting, there's no way you understand economics. And that wipes out 99% of the, not 99%, wipes out 92%, let's say, of the accounting profession, because of the economics profession, because about 8% are heterodox, I would say.
Right. I mean, I got to Godley, I don't know, 15 plus years ago, and realized what he was saying, and that was really important. And I felt that this was a way forward. I didn't intend to, well, I didn't even come across MMT until 2013 for the first time, and I didn't actually really get into it in a big way. I wrote my book, I'm not going to hold it up, The Joy of Tax.
Joy of Tax,
which has sold ridiculously well, probably because of the title. But that basically has a sort of MMT explanation, which I'd never actually really read MMT at the time I wrote it. Because I based it on double entry. I realized what was going on. I realized that actually all the thinking I'd been doing about tax meant that tax and money were always, as far as I could see, the flip side of each other. Effectively, they were a form of double entry of each other, and you couldn't actually make the system work without understanding the intimate relationships between the two. And that's where I really got into realizing how absolutely fundamental this understanding of money within the economy is. And yet, when I look back at my macro teaching and what I've read since, and I've read a lot more macro since I left university than I ever read while I was at university, it's, as you say, virtually absent. And then you go and actually, I retaught myself general equilibrium, thank you for the plug. I mean, it's a bit out of date now, by the way, if I'm honest. You'll get much better stuff from my blog than from that these days, I suspect. But it's sold about 15,000 copies, which I'm pretty pleased with. I suspect Debunking Economics, which I read a long time ago, by the way, Steve, that's where I first came across you. And, read this and just thought, Christ, this guy's clever. And he's saying things which, why wasn't I told years ago? And you made me think about theories of small numbers and how small numbers behaved, and it completely shattered any belief that I had left in microeconomic theory. And how absurd that was. The assumptions made about, from perfect competition onwards just don't withstand a basic understanding of modern mathematics.
Yeah,
And you realize,
need.
yeah, literally, just understand a bit of maths, go read it, understand some modern maths. And again, I bothered to go and read up on some maths and thinking and chaos and small numbers and God knows what else. And you do that and you think, none of this stuff works. Why are they still teaching it?
Yeah, it's a religion.
It is a religion. And actually, I was most amused when I first moved to Ely, where I live now. I met the vice dean of the cathedral. We have the 6th largest cathedral in the UK. It was started to build in 1080, and it's still there. It's enormous in proportion to the town, little city, enormous cathedral. And the vice dean had just done a PhD on the theology of the privatization of the electricity and gas supply industries in the UK. Now, that's a pretty niche PhD, you'd think. But he was interested in economics and he was interested in theology, so that ticked his boxes. And as he put it to me, I tell you, he said, people think I'm pretty crazy believing in the virgin birth, but that's so straightforward and obvious compared to microeconomics. The belief required to actually sustain microeconomic theory, he said, and there's no point going to macro because it's all built on micro, and that if micro is rubbish, so is macro. And I thought that was really interesting that this guy had come from a completely different discipline, and yet came to that conclusion. And he's right.
I want to bring in Mike into this conversation. Give your thoughts. I love putting you on the spot instantly like this, Mike, but give your thoughts on the conversation so far. Double entry bookkeeping, the importance of that in economics. Let's hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, hi to Richard and hi to everybody. So Richard, I think you and I are the same age. I went to university, college, starting in 1976 as well. And I got interested in economics because as a high school senior, my father, who was an accountant, one day slapped the Wall Street Journal in front of me and said, read the front page and the editorial page and tell me one thing that interested you. So I didn't want to do it. I was 16 or whatever I was, but I did it. And then he said the next day, do it again. And pretty soon he didn't have to tell me. I was reading the Wall Street Journal on my own. When I went to school, my dad said, at least take a couple accounting courses. You don't have to be an accountant, but you should be able to read financial statements and what have you. So you and I can probably appreciate, I was doing accounting. You probably were too, on green accounting paper. There was no Lotus 123 or Excel or anything like that, right? You got to gain a fundamental understanding of how a business takes measurements, right, and what the managers react to and so forth. So then I started majoring in economics, and you're absolutely right. It's like, well, how come economists, you can get a PhD in economics and not be able to read financial statements, have no idea. You study the theory of the firm, but it has no relationship to real business entities. And I always thought that was quite unusual. Why is that? And it's something of a path-dependent process, I guess. Economists are taught what their teachers were taught, who were taught what their teachers were taught. And you want to publish your papers in journals. You don't want to study the economy. And you know how to get that done. You've got to conform to the standards that everybody else is conforming to. And so that's what happens. But the folks who can redo economics according to the real world, right? Redo the theory of the firm, but using the tools that are really used in the business world and rethinking through everything. I think that is of enormous importance, as well as, it's funny, Steve talks about how you can study economics and come away with the conclusion that money doesn't matter. My experience has been when you talk to people who are not economists and they say, oh, I'm an economics major, I'm an economist, they say, all you care about is money. It's like, no, but that's, the general public often has that particular, perspective. So anyway, so good to see you. Welcome. And rah-rah to double entry accounting.
Hey, Mike, I got a question for you, and we're gonna then lob it back to Steve, and I'm curious about where do you think the direction for micro is? Is it elaborating on what you were just explaining about the mechanics of how businesses run? Is that where the analysis actually starts?
That's where it should go. That's what we do when we do system dynamics. We have accounting sectors, and we try and find out, well, what do managers do? What do they respond to? We have balance sheets, income statements, all that stuff in our micro models. But that is not where the field is going. I think the economics profession is more and more turning to behavioral economics. They're recognizing that simply assuming Mr. Spock, Homo economicus, rational economic man, is maybe not the greatest of ideas. I think game theory has taken hold. So, it's a chess match. I know that you know that I know that you know are going to make this move, kind of thing. And I think the other micro thing that's really gaining traction now in the field is big data. So all these data that are out there being collected in the internet, how do you use that somehow to sort of redefine? And there's probably an AI thing that's going to happen. God only knows what that will be. But I don't see microeconomists saying, wow, we should find out what businesses really do and start modeling that. And, I just don't think that's going to happen.
Steve.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the absolute opposite of that, in fact. The classic instance of this is the work of Alan Blinder. You know Alan Blinder at all, Richard?
I don't think I do.
Ex-president of ex-vice president of the American Economic Association, ex-VP of the Federal Reserve. So he's, totally mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a survey, but being a new Keynesian, he wanted to explain why prices were sticky, because the big difference between so-called new classicals and so-called new Keynesians is new classical believe prices adjust instantly. And I've got an oops message here. I hope I'm still on the show. Okay. So he did a survey, why prices are sticky. And as part of it, they sent out PhD students to interview leading managers of leading corporations. They surveyed 200 firms. The firms were responsible for 8% of America's GDP. It's a huge survey in statistical terms. And the answer came back, 89% of firms reported constant or falling marginal cost. Now that completely threw Blinder. And what he said was, quote, this is a direct quote from his chapter 4 of the book, says, the overwhelmingly bad news, brackets, for economic theory, close brackets, is that apparently only 11% of manufacturing GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal costs. And he finally said, whether they understood our questions or not, and frankly, it wasn't the questions weren't understood, the answers weren't understood by a bunch of fucking neoclassical who can't understand anybody having falling marginal costs. He said it paints a difference that is totally different to that which is immortalized in the textbooks. Well, he has a textbook. He took over writing Baumol's textbook. So it's now Baumol and Blinder. And what occurred to me was, does he regurgitate his own research? Does he teach his own students what he found out about the state of American economy? The answer is, not only is it no, he even stuffs up the conventional theory. Because, of course, the basis of rising marginal costs is diminishing marginal productivity. So he gives an explanation that says diminishing marginal productivity was not a logical deduction by economists. It was an empirical discovery. Well, that's fucking bullshit, okay? It's always been a logical deduction, never had any empirical behind it. The empirical, in fact, contradicts it. And then he gives an example of diminishing marginal productivity, which involves the change in the productivity of Chinese agriculture over a 25-year period, which breaches one of the conditions for diminishing marginal productivity. So he obviously, the guy, his brain was scrambled by being confronted with the real world. And therefore he had a choice. He could either break away and become somebody like you or me, or he could stick with the religion. And he stuck with the religion, but he scrambled it so badly that if any student used Blinder's explanation for diminishing marginal productivity, historically discovered, and used his example, changing amount of capital over time, they'd be failed in any other course in microeconomics.
Yeah.
Hey,
can Richard, I come back to another point here, though, if I can jump in? And this is based upon a lot of work that I'm doing at the moment, because, I've ended up as a professor of accounting. The last job I was a professor of international political economy. I've been a visiting professor of sustainability. Now I'm a professor of accounting. Who knows? I haven't changed the work very much between the different job titles. But the point now is that the accounting one is, I'm working with colleagues mainly at Sheffield and Copenhagen Business School on ideas around what you might call the microeconomic theory of, well, actually accounting, not the firm. But of course, they're overlapped, you would hope. But actually, we keep coming to the conclusion that we're looking at firms which aren't microeconomic. They're macroeconomic.
They're so big, They
are so big that actually they are deemed by regulation to be called public interest entities. Now, if they're a public interest entity, by definition, they have a range of stakeholders beyond the owner or the manager. There is a recognition of the externality. And yet the theory of accounting recognizes none of that. It does not recognize that there is such a thing as an externality. So we actually now have got the problem that accounting is based upon a microeconomic theory of the firm, which doesn't recognize that any individual accounting entity is capable of influencing the world around it, because, of course, it's an entity that exists in a perfect market, which is, as we all know, complete nonsense. And yet they refuse to move the boundary to recognize where that true boundary of the impact of that entity is on society and how it should be accounting. So I'm doing work around accounting and sustainability. I mean, literally, it's called sustainable cost accounting. And that is, how do we put the cost of the transition for climate change onto the balance sheet? And I was challenged by a couple of people, curiously, from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales to do this, because nobody had done it. So it took me a couple of hours sitting having a coffee down by the river here in Ely, and I thought about it. And I thought, well, I can easily do that. I just literally look at what the cost of eliminating carbon from the processes of this business would be. I make it an accounting provision for closing down the existing business, as if it's, you put such a provision on the cost of closing down a nuclear power plant, for example. Well, I can put the same thing on closing down the carbon-based business of this company, and I put in a provision for the cost of creating the non-carbon-based business of this company, because, of course, it wants to claim it's a going concern. And that way we can build the externality of dealing with environment into the microeconomic, if you wish, thinking of this entity. Now, that then absolutely plays with the mindset of not just theoretical accountants, the accounting academic, but actually the accountants of the world, because they can't handle the idea that there's a big world beyond their balance sheet, which is defined by the interest of the shareholder. But the shareholder is absolutely irrelevant these days. Who is behind BlackRock? And BlackRock are, and a few others are the big shareholders. So you don't even understand who the shareholder is, because the shareholder's a nominee for somebody else, who's a nominee for somebody else, who's a nominee for somebody else, for all the tiers we go through. So we actually need to view most accounting issues of consequence now as if they were macroeconomic, and then play with these relatively limited number of entities. As you say, Steve, you can survey a fairly reasonable number of companies and come with a large part of GDP. And I think that that's where we're in a really interesting phase, because the microeconomic theory of the firm should include a macroeconomic theory of the firm, which looks at the externality that it creates for the society around it. And at the moment, accounting is nowhere near that. So we don't.
And economics even further away.
Yeah. So we need to change both. And actually, they do need to walk in sync with each other to finding a way to talk about the real economy that we live in. That is, I mean, I just notice our average ages around here, and obviously Ty is, way, way behind us all. But, if we're going to be concerned about
the voice of youth in the background,
and I was just thinking that my son's coming around, for supper in 90 minutes time. If I'm concerned about his well-being, then I need to actually address these issues. And to me, that's where my most interesting research is heading right now. We're playing around with this issue quite a bit, and I feel that we're touching on areas of the great unknown. And we're talking about the accountable space in accounts, and that's what's within the boundaries of the existing microeconomic entity. But what I'm interested in is the unaccountable space. that space which is beyond being accounted for, but where nonetheless the impact of the double entry actually does still exist. And that to me is really interesting. And we've got a long way to go to understand that, in my thinking, if we're talking about this relationship between micro, macro, and accounting, which I believe is really important theoretically to the development of our understanding of sustainability.
Hey, Richard, I got a question for you. I mean, and it has to do with the theory of what you just explained. And I'm curious, why is it just a bandwidth issue as to why you're focusing more on like multinational, big, like large corporations? The smaller corporations, or the aggregate of small business in North America, I know, for example, is a large part of the economy as an aggregate. And so can that
No, it's not.
No?
No, it's not. This is the fascinating thing. I wanted to bring this up earlier because, I mean, but Mike was talking about how micro is moving in the direction of behavioral theory and behavioral economics and game theory and so on. That is all looking at from the point of view consumer, fundamentally consumers, or, firms of equal size, oligopoly type competition and stuff like that. When you take a look at the actual structure of the economy, it follows what's called a power law. You have lots of small firms and very few large firms. And if you plot the log of the number of firms on one side and the log of the scale of the market to have on the other, you get a straight line. And that destroys the whole idea of an average. And it makes a farce, in fact, of talking about perfect competition. It's as well as the mathematical flaws that I pointed out in debunking economics. It makes, because in terms of the structure of the economy, it is nothing like the taxonomy that students get taught in microeconomics. There is no such thing as a perfectly competitive firm, even leaving aside the fact it's mathematically impossible.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a monopolized industry. There's no such thing as an oligopolized industry. There is a powerful distribution of firms in every sector. When you look at the aggregate level, it's almost a perfect power line fit. When you look at the smaller scale, you get some deviation. But fundamentally, there are lots of small firms and a few large firms and an aggregation in all the and that gives you an evolutionary process, which is the sort of thing we should be studying. And that you can't rule out the small firms, but what the small firms are trying to become has become large firms. And the fact that there is a large firm in the economy is what stimulates them to have the evolutionary change that gives you radical movements in who's what size, but overall the same basic power law distribution remains. And
Well,
that's
actually,
what
can I challenge you something on that, Steve? I don't.
Go for it.
I mean, I've dealt with a lot of small firms. The vast majority of small firms actually want to be small firms.
That's true.
There are, of course, and I've been involved with both, small firms that want to become large firms. They obviously have a different trajectory. What we need in that, I don't ignore that at all, Dan. That's not at all my issue. I mean, I think that what we're trying to do is actually build a model of accounting which is intended for the small firm and maybe the growing firm, but we apply it to the large firm where it is obviously inappropriate. What we don't have at all is a model of the firm which is not intending to grow, either because its owners don't want it to, and that is the normal condition. They are not maximizers. True. They are actually satisficers in a very real sense, and they've chosen a lifestyle business, and they actually have lifestyle consumers who buy from them as well. And there's a model there which actually has totally different key performance indicators, to use accounting jargon, where the accounting model.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I think
we'll bring him right back on here. Let's see if we can get him. There he is.
Lost you. Yeah. Okay.
You lost me.
Keep going. Yeah.
Okay.
Back in again.
We just have this problem that we have this assumption that there is a theory of a firm, but actually we have multiple models of firms, and we need multiple models of accounting for that. And really, the indicators are what is of concern to the stakeholder of the entity. And the stakeholder model is quite different if you're looking at the really micro entity. I mean, the very small entity, which doesn't want to grow, the medium size and the large company. And so we need different models for each of those with different consequences for each model as well. But the macro entity is this thing, the public interest entity, the PI, as it's called. And public interest entities are clearly, by the description, of macro concern. They are the too big to fails in their sector. So how can we possibly treat those with a microeconomic theory of the firm? It makes no sense at all. I mean, they rely always automatically, for example, on, and this is not just banks, although we've seen it most in terms of banks, they rely on an external source of capital, which is some form of government guarantee of continuity in most cases.
Look, guys, I want to wrap this part of it up, but I want to give it a chance for Steve and for Mike to say something. But I want to prime Richard. I have a question about the Green New Deal. Okay. But before we get into there, is there anything else that Steve, yourself, or Mike would like to say about the micro discussion that we're having? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. So from a system dynamics point of view, we've always argued that a theory of the firm, if you want to think about it that way, should involve the concept of a corporation as a complex system. And that the idea is to see how it's currently performing, however you want to measure that, profits, social good, whatever. You have to define what you're going to measure. And then say, okay, how can we redesign this system so that it performs better? And once you've got better figured out, you want to make it robust and resilient. So when it's shocked from the outside world, when the orange crop freezes in Florida unexpectedly, when there's a sudden exchange rate change by a central bank somewhere, when there's a crisis somewhere in the world that is unexpected and the system is shocked, that the newly designed corporate structure is robust and it doesn't sink the ship, that the goodness is preserved. So that, as Richard was saying, requires, different firms in different industries, different sizes and what have you, have to be treated differently, right? And eventually you'd have a whole catalog of these models of different kinds of systems, corporations in different industries. And you'd have some general principles on how to make them better, robust, and what have you. And that's sort of from the system dynamics point of view, I guess, how we would begin to think about redoing microeconomics.
All right, guys. Well, we're having a great chat here. This episode is going really well. Dan's going to keep leading the questions here, but I have to do some housekeeping. First, I got to say thank you to everybody that's joining in. Thank you to all of the chatters. I'm going to make a graphic, I promise, that does this, right beside all these fine gentlemen. Keep chatting. Make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel if you would like more content from Professor Steve Keen. Comment underneath the video. That really helps with the algorithm. You can say you don't like it, or you can say you can like it. Either way, it shows engagement, so we like that. If you're over on Twitter, which I see we've got about 30 viewers there, you can hit the retweet button, like, and then come over here and join the chat. If you've got some burning questions you want to ask Richard, Steve, Mike, Daniel, or myself, please ask them. Dan, I'm going to give it back to you and take the show in another direction.
I really want to take it. I have a burning question about Green New Deal, but I want to just give Steve one last chance. Is there anything that you have, any remnants of our previous conversation that you want to wrap up on micro? He's trying.
Do you know the work of Robert Axtell? Sorry. Okay. Do you know the work of Robert Axtell, Richard, and Mike? Okay. So I actually met Richard. I met Robert at the FSRIF for Alan Kerman at the Bank of England about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and he's done brilliant work on the power law distribution of firm sizes. He was the one who first identified that power law distribution, and he's a lovely bloke. But I think I may have actually hurt his feelings somewhat, because he asked me to comment on his next book coming out, and he had none of the data on the actual empirical work into the cost functions of real firms. So I wrote back, and I haven't heard back yet. I've got to basically, if I can maybe unburn some bridges there. But he made a perfect point, saying any theory of the firm has to be able to reproduce the actual distribution of firm sizes to be regarded as valid. And the thing is, neoclassical theory is a complete and abject failure on that front, which he's well aware of. Okay, but if you look at the theories of the firm we have, none of them make any sense of the actual structure of the economy. Yeah. And what I'll let Mike come in a sec. I'll just finish this particular line. I think if you actually had a model that comes out of Andrew's work in the 1930s of falling average cost, for a firm as they increase output. The bigger you get, the more your sales make, the more profit you make, the more capacity you have to invest, the more you're going to grow. And you will therefore get a parallel distribution quite possibly coming out of that structure. And I've got one of my ex-PhD students building a net logo model of that right now. Mike, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Just a real quick point. Economists are trained to do theory, so they have a logical framework in mind and they represent it mathematically and they derive testable hypotheses. Then they go to the real world, which means download a data set from some website and torture it with econometrics and statistics. What economists are not trained to do is what Richard does and did for a living, is get out from behind your desk, go to a real bank, a real service company, a real manufacturing company, whatever, and find out what the hell they do. Ask people, what do you do all day? They can tell you, right? And then start to write your equations. And until we get our rear ends out from behind our desks as economists and find out what's going on, microeconomics will be lost.
And this is actually to finish on that point. Most people know Milton Friedman's assumptions don't matter bullshit methodology. That bullshit methodology was written specifically to tell people not to read papers on empirical research into what firms actually do. He referenced the discussion in the AER and said you might as well go and ask a pool player, how does he sink a billiard ball? And he'll say he rubs a rabbit's foot, and things like that. And you better off, you say he obeys the laws of physics or actually sink the ball. The reality is that what he had as a model of the firm's behavior equate marginal cost and marginal revenue. Any firm that did that would go bankrupt overnight if they're actually run properly. So it's just sheer nonsense. Yeah, we're never going to get it out of economists. So I would actually love to have accountants and system dynamics people and other people take over this field. And when economists complain about it, say, you fit the data, mate. And they can't do it, of course.
I mean, can I just, this is the final comment, I hope, from me on this. Yeah. If you equate marginal cost to marginal revenue, you will never cover your overheads because they're fixed. Exactly. You are therefore up the Swanee. You're bust. Done. Yeah. Gone. It's bizarre.
It's bizarre, but the reason they do it is because if you say you equate marginal cost to marginal revenue, what you're doing is maximizing the gap between utility and the cost of production under the assumption that marginal cost rises, which is false. Yeah. Okay? Because if economists design factories, they'd look like Mankiw's model of them, which is overcrowded and working beyond capacity. And in fact, in the real world, you build with an idea growth, so you must have excess capacity. You're uncertain about the future, and you don't want to be constrained by inadequate capital. So you've got more capital than you need, and any firm that operates with less capital than it needs is going to go bankrupt overnight. Yep. So it is totally fantastical nonsense theory of the real world, and that's why we've got to get rid of the bastards.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we got a group here that are all fans of Milton Friedman, and I'm thinking we should, there's this nice moniker at the end that says, still friends after. So we could stress test this environment. Okay, I'm thinking of you, Mike. There, right? We add some sort of stress to the system. Let's bring the libertarians in, the alt-rights. Let's bring them in, and let's see if we're still friends afterwards. So, anyways, I wanted to bring up my next question about a Green New Deal, and I'm wondering, in your own words, how was the Green New Deal envisioned as somebody that came up with and helped shape that idea? Where is it now? And can you describe the Green New Deal in your own words? I'd love to hear that, Richard.
Well, look, the Green New Deal was an accident in a very real sense. I mean, it comes down to a chap called Colin Hines. Colin was an economist of sorts, he would say that, who worked for Greenpeace in the 1990s. He knows everyone in the green movement, nearest damn it. We were very worried. Colin and I started working together in 2002. We were working particularly on ideas about funding for local authorities and developments around green issues, and the use of bond finance. And this was because of what was happening at that time. Remember, we were effectively in the UK going through an economic downturn, being supported by government spending, which was rising rapidly to do an anti-austerity, reverse of a stimulus, and we were arguing how to use that. We started working on that, and then we began to realize that there were serious problems. Obviously, from what Colin had worked on, we got the problems of climate change. We got problems of shortage of economic resources, oil, gas, minerals, etc. And we recognized that there was also financial stress. And so Colin brought together a rather eclectic group of people, 3 former chief executives of Friends of the Earth, a couple of people from the New Economics Foundation, me, Anne Pettifor, and Anne and I sometimes get on, and sometimes we disagree with each other, and it's always done in good humor. But we don't always see eye to eye on everything around MMT and how money is created. She's got different theories, and Caroline Lucas, who was then a Green European MP, and we sat down and we said, look, we recognize that from all our various backgrounds, we see that there is an environmental crisis coming and there's a financial crisis coming. We all believed that the economy was going to fall over by 2007. That was our one common factor. So we started to write a report to say there's going to be the most almighty recession. Our working model was, we can't waste this crisis. We've got to put it to use to actually begin doing the green world that we want. When the world falls over, we'll have a report ready sitting on the desk to, for people to use. We published as a result in July 2008. And of course, the world finally fell over in September 2008, although Northern Rock had certainly given us a pre-warning, as had stress in the bond market in Paris and elsewhere in 2007. So we knew this was going to happen. And there it was. Suddenly, we had got a good name. It had briefly been used by somebody in America, but we were the first people to put a set of ideas, a set of funding ideas. It was deeply, truly Keynesian rather than new Keynesian. It was in some senses heterodox. Certainly Anne and I think both.
Richard, why was it truly Keynesian? What's that reference? That
Jeff Tiley from the TUC was responsible for some bits of it. And I mean in that sense that it reflected Keynes's monetarist ideas, i.e. his theories on money, not Keynes as Hicks and others would have had him, Samuelson and others would have had him, but as I think we could say Keynes wrote in the 30s, and as I read Keynes in that sense. So there were ideas there which Anne is very committed to, which I'm less committed to, but which I think are relevant and certainly worthy of note. And particularly because they challenge the boundaries between monetary and fiscal policy, which I think is one of the great shibboleths that we actually need to address inside economics as well, because I don't really recognize that they are distinct. I think they're actually inevitably the two sides of a coin, and therefore to try to manage one side, the debits only with one side of the policy and the credits with the other side of the policy, whichever side you wish to put the debits and the credits doesn't really matter. You're actually using different policies to manage two sides of an entry, opposite sides of an entry. I think that's crazy. So those ideas were all sitting there, and basically we were saying, let's have a Keynesian stimulus because we're going to have a downturn. Let's think about how we fund government differently. Because quite clearly what we've been doing doesn't work. Let's look again at how we are actually going to put together ideas about long-term use of funding, which isn't actually just the balancing number in the equation of the deficit, which is what the gilt market, the treasury market and so on are, but is instead, in fact, actually turning private savings into public capital, which was something that basically doesn't exist anymore because there is no such equation of S equals I in the real world. Investment is funded by credit. It is not funded by savings anymore. So we were saying, how do we actually overcome this relationship and actually make people understand the relevance? There were tax elements in the funding because this was, the real era of tax justice when we were growing enormously popular and we were challenging the multinationals who weren't paying. So we put in a lot of stuff around tax and the tax gap and issues around that. So it was a bit of a collection of those who were grabbed around Anne Pettifor's table, if you like, because we actually always wrote this over a takeaway meal in Anne's flat in London. And the bizarre thing was that actually I lived furthest away, and they used to have a joke that I used to leave at around 9 in the evening. And they'd say to me, well, you've got a couple of hours to get home, Richard. Send us the whole summary of that, write it all up and have a chapter for us in the morning. And by and large, I did, which was crazy. So we produced a plan.
I want to just jump in there, and I want to bring Steve into this. Steve, do you remember that conversation with Peter Bofinger and Anne? Remember when Peter attacked your academic credentials? I mean, that was quite a ambush there. Do you think maybe we should try and get Anne on the show? That would be very interesting.
Like Anne's a good friend, so there's no problem getting Anne on there. She'd be fine.
Yeah,
Anne's lovely, and I mean, she's the classic activist. People don't know Anne's history all that well. I'll give a bit of background to her. She was a member of a fairly conservative South African family. She became completely convinced of the anti-apartheid attitude. She ended up being involved in quite a few of the disputes. She knew Steve Biko personally. She found out she was actually likely to get killed if she stayed in South Africa. So she moved to the UK, ended up leading the Jubilee 2000 campaign to cancel the debt of the world's 100 poorest countries quite successfully. So in terms of actually bringing about a successful campaign, I think I'd have to say Anne has been more successful than anybody else I know in terms of bringing about real change in some system. So she's a great character, and very, very happy to have her on board one day.
And she's robust, and she really is robust because she goes and does her thinking. I mean, and when Anne and I disagree with each other, and we do sometimes, it's always done in a good humor about the fact that at the end of the day, we don't agree, but we still end up having yet another takeaway or whatever it might be that we're going to eat around Anne's table and move on to the next stage. We're meeting up next month, and so is it going on? Yes, it is. The development has been odd. And we had our moment in the sun. It was extraordinary. We launched in July 2008. By October, this chap Barack Obama was talking about the Green New Deal, which was kind of strange. You don't expect to find a phrase you've been using and the context you've used it in to be basically in a presidential campaign in months, but it was. It was heavily talked about in 2008, 9, 10, and then we hit austerity. And Osborne introduced it in the UK. He, fed it into Europe pretty successfully, and the mood changed, and we went through the doldrums. Basically, nobody paid any attention to it anymore. And it wasn't until Anne, and I'll give her full credit for this, actually sold it into the Democrats in the States. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got hold of it. And it became part of the thinking of the young Democrats, basically, that more radical Democratic grouping, that we saw the Green New Deal rise again, and it was re-promoted from the US. But it was lifted almost exactly from what we've been doing. Now here we tend to focus much more upon how we can talk about funding mechanisms. So a lot of the effort is on how do you pay for it? Answering the question which every journalist comes up with all the time, you've got a good idea, but how are you going to pay for it? We can't afford to save the world. It's really a shame, but we've got to balance the books. And what's more important than keeping our kids alive, after all, isn't it? Balanced budget's the real issue. So we talk about how that works. So we're trying to communicate now. A lot of the focus that I'm doing on it is about how do we actually communicate some rather basic messages. This is one of the themes of my blog continually. In fact, I've just changed the name of the blog to talking about funding the future, because that's really what we're talking about heavily. And the focus is about how do we build a sustainable economy, and how can we find the economic resources to do it? Always believing Keynes's maxim, which was, if we're able to do it, we can afford it. And that's
all right.
the
Well,
point there.
Sorry, Richard. We're going to go into the next part of the show, and we're going to actually carry on your stream of thought there. We'll try to anyways. And then we'll kind of switch gears, because I want to touch on MMT and some of your thoughts around that. I think there is a group of people that want to hear that from you. So we'll touch on that. We'll touch on system dynamics, because, well, I know Mike loves system dynamics. I know Steve loves Minsky because he made it, and I love Minsky because I use it. So we're going to go into the next part of the show. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, keep chatting. We'll be right back. And we did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it, so fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning. We're still friends after the show. I'm going to bring in Dan first because this is Dan and I's little side area, our little side hustle each weekend. Dan, I'm thinking I haven't ever asked a guest to read the top chatters list, and this is I'll unmute you. What do you think, Dan? Should we get Richard to read that list, or is that going to be too much? Because those are some complicated names.
Richard's a flywheel. I mean, did you listen to him speak? I mean, he can just go, right? I think he can do it in record speed. So the preface here for Richard, I'm like, get the pronunciation 100% as best as you can, but just fly through it. Let's see what you can do, Richard. Come on in.
I think so. So we'll bring on Richard. Richard, are you prepared to read the top chatter list from last week?
Yeah, I give most things a go, and I don't think this one is going to cause me too many litigation problems, so I can risk that,
All right, I'm going to bring it up. Here it is. Richard, go ahead.
Nazarius, Tarek Fahim, Botched Mandala, Ghost on the Half Shell, Huge N, Niels Rademacher, Lost Adult, Lana Dell Hates the Clock, The Hasty Ent, and Joe Polito. Those were your stars.
Good.
Beautiful stuff. I'm going to be doing that sound effect after each completion of that list. Now, actually, that list is a little bit easier this week, mainly because I thought I'd have to read them.
You got to give him his props. It's that British accent. It's just like, it's the views alone just from that silky British voice is just, is going to propel us into like a new stratosphere of broadcasting. I'm excited to see how this, all thanks to Richard. Thanks, Richard.
Well,
I actually,
one of my secrets is I have a twin brother.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
He was a broadcaster for 35 years. So some of it rubbed off somewhere along the way.
The famous twin studies. Okay, let's talk about that. I mean, that would be interesting. We could throw you into a social experiment and
Whatever it is, he and I aren't alike.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely everything. He's a great guy, but I doubt we'd have even ever met each other unless we happened to share a womb. He is my womb mate, as I call him.
Yeah, from roommate to wingman. Okay, all right.
So, viewers of the show, remember to hit that like button. I'll keep reminding you till the day I die or the day we cancel this show, which, there is that possibility. Steve kind of goes off the rails sometimes, so YouTube might say enough's enough, and they would just shut us down. I wanna touch on, I wouldn't say it's the elephant in the room, but it was brought up a few weeks ago, and I want to frame this the right way. As I understand it, Richard, you are a supporter of MMT, though you have some difficulties with some of its framing from some of its proponents. Am I right?
You're walking very carefully there, Ty. Well done. Look, I've always had a problem with some aspects of MMT as what I might call its founders, and in particular Warren Mosler and perhaps Bill Mitchell, maybe Randy Ray, but less Randy, I think. Warren and Bill in particular have framed it, particularly with regard to tax. As I explained earlier, I sort of got to this point where I understood the relationship between money and tax by coming from the tax angle and realizing I couldn't understand tax unless I understood money. And so I had to link the two together, and I arrived at an understanding which was frankly pretty MMT by 2013 without actually having read anything by any of the MMT authors, bluntly. And then actually I discovered, I went back and checked the first entries on my post with MMT, and it was in 2013. I said, hey, I've read this stuff and I seem to be a modern monetary theorist. I didn't make another mention of it for another couple of years or so. And during that period, I've been working around what is QE? How does QE work? Why is QE in the way the government was doing it appeared to me wrong? How could we do it better? And all of that linked back to thinking I'd done over years about MMT. But my big concern was that MMT just seemed to take this number tax and call it T in the equation of G equals T plus delta B plus delta M, as I see it, the change in borrowing, the change in money creation and tax. And this equation sort of lumped this number as if it was, well, just a balancing figure in the equation. And I didn't buy that, because another aspect of the work I'm doing with a different colleague at Sheffield University, a chap called Andrew Baker, I've been doing quite a bit of work around taxation systems, how taxation systems are managed, how transparency exists, but also about how we actually increase understanding of tax and how tax behaves in the modern economy. And in my view, tax is actually a withdrawal mechanism fundamentally. This is the point I got to where I agree with MMT. The government spends first. It then withdraws the money that it has spent to the degree it wishes to control the overall level of inflation, meaning that inflation is controlled effectively by fiscal policy. And I don't think monetary policy has very much role in inflation control at all. So this is important. But once you've actually understood that when you are planning that, you have then liberated tax from this role as a revenue raiser, you then allow tax to be used as a mechanism for the delivery of other social policy. So it redistributes income and wealth, it reprices market failure, it's all about the whole process of fiscal, economic, social policy. And actually, it's also the consideration, in my opinion, in the social contract, because actually there's very strong evidence. Wow. It's mainly from African countries where the work has been done, that people who pay income tax do have a tendency to vote, and those who pay income taxes, direct taxes, don't have a tendency to vote. So there's quite a strong link there. The work was done quite a while ago, but it's based at the University of Sussex by a team. Michael Moore was the guy Mick Moore was the guy, Professor Mick Moore led that research team, and around 2005-ish, I think the papers were mainly written. But quite interesting theories all around. And my point is that, therefore, you can't view MMT, again, this is almost double entry. You can't view the money side of this without actually fully understanding the tax side. So I wrote a number of papers around this. I wrote one in Real World Economic Review. Andrew and I had a paper in a journal on social policy. Forgotten the name of the journal. That's embarrassing. Published by Cambridge University Press. For actually, we actually won a prize for that one. And some various other papers around this theory that MMT liberates us to look at tax in a totally different way. And that's begun to be noticed. I mean, the work we're doing now, Andrew and I, is being picked up with OECD, IMF, and World Bank. Now, that's real world impact. That's reason why my university likes me, because this is real world impact. If we look at tax in these different management systems, then we end up with different ways. But I wouldn't have got there, I think, in the end of the day, with the confidence if I hadn't read MMT. But then when I read Warren Mosler say the whole purpose of tax is to create unemployment, I sort of recoil. But that Warren put up a paper on April the 7th on Twitter in a debate I just happened to get involved with on Twitter. And, as you noticed, I've got quite a lot of Twitter followers, 230,000. I'm a little surprised by that. My younger son pointed out the other day, if I want to meet them all, I have to book Wembley Stadium for 3 nights, which is an interesting idea. I won't be. Sorry, folks. Can't afford to do that. Ticket prices would be high to cover the cost. But, the point is, there was this debate, and Warren put up what he called his ultimate definition of MMT. And all inflation is down to the government, he says. It's all dependent upon what the government is willing to pay for goods and services. And the whole purpose of tax is to make resources unemployed so that the government might buy them. And the number of assumptions that come into that are pretty staggering. For example, it appears to assume that there was an economy in balance before government intervention. It appears to suggest that Say's laws worked before the government intervened. I mean, literally, there was an economy where supply would generate demand, and it's being disrupted by taxation to create available resources for the government to buy. The government doesn't intervene in the marketplace. And all of this is to basically come up with a narrative to say that it is tax that provides the value to currency. And I don't buy the idea that tax is the sole determinant of what gives currency value. I think that comes up from a whole range of interactions in the economy, the whole process of interaction, and the enforcement of commercial contracts settled in money is what also gives currency value. So I've explored all those issues over the last few weeks, and I'm particularly arguing with that one paper from Warren, which I felt was incredibly difficult to present as an argument for MMT. Dan, I can see you're trying to come in.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, I mean, it's like, is this a valid critique or argument to be added? And we love using this word exogenous, right? So the outside influence of other nations related to nations with fiat currencies. I mean, there's other nations that influence this. Is this valid to discuss and put into models of how a nation is in relation to other nations on the world stage? Because I'm not hearing that in your assumptions, right? I mean, am I missing something, or?
So are you missing in my assumptions, or are you missing in?
Well, you tried to summarize assumptions of your fundamental critique of MMT, and me going into this a little more blind than you are is I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, we're a mechanism, or if we were to describe inflation, I don't think it's not limited to a country. It's not.
No.
It's
Let
not
me be clear.
isolated.
I don't buy those assumptions I've just mentioned. I'm challenging those assumptions, and I think you're absolutely right. Those assumptions, and this is one of the critiques of MMT as it's often put forward, is that that's great for the USA, and it's great for a country which produces the only reserve currency the world has really got. But what about everybody else? Well, how do we react to that? And anyway, even for the USA, there are actually world pressures. I mean, there is this argument right now that, why have we suffered inflation? I don't think it was because of QE. For once, I actually agree with a paper which came out from the Bank of England this week, which discussed that issue. I didn't agree any of the reasoning why they got to their argument that QE is not the cause of inflation in the UK at present. I mean, they did a whole ISLM model, which seemed to me to be particularly naive in its approach and analysis, which I, frankly didn't discuss on my blog when I came to that paper. But the actual data seems to support the idea that we did not have a QE created issue. We have actually had an exogenous shock. We've had multiple exogenous shocks, in fact. I mean, one is obviously Brexit in the UK, one is a war in Ukraine, one is, and the market speculation on that. But we've also actually seen, and this is an exogenous shock, the world trading markets have exploited that situation to actually change prices generically around the world in a way that there was a presumption of shortage to come, which didn't actually materialize. And they imposed inflation on national economies as a consequence of an integrated worldwide commodity market function. So there's all sorts of functions which are exogenous. So to argue that inflation comes purely because of the way in which the government prices its engagement with the economy seems to me to be, well, naive at best. And not a very useful basis for creating that thing which I'm always interested in, sound policy indicators for action. To me, that's the only purpose for doing theory, is to explain how can we apply this into a way to make the world better. And again, with regard to this theory of taxation, I don't get it, because in fact, I mean, there is a very strong current in MMT, and I've been engaging with this, and obviously Ty might have seen this, that all tax is imposed violently. Now, that is a Weberian, from Max Weber, theory of the state that the state has a monopoly of violence, and it is through the exercise of that monopoly of violence that it imposes its administration for the common good. It's a very odd idea that you use violence to promote the common good. And there are plenty of others who have come up with alternative, more enlightened theories around that. And I'm doing a bit of reading around that issue at the moment, particularly a chap called Ruggie, Ruggie, a 1982 paper I just looked at, which is very interesting in this area. And I do need to do some more reading around this stuff because it's ages since I looked at that. And this is underpinning of international political economy theory anyway, this stuff about the theory of the state. But my point here is that I think that these are very naive explanations. And actually, I don't even think they are particularly relevant to MMT. It's as if MMT believes it has to have a creation narrative. What started the ball rolling, the chicken or the egg? Was it the tax or the spend that came first? Now, first of all, their theory of tax and spend first is actually incomplete with regard to double entry, because in fact, they actually have the tax first because they impose the tax, create the liability, then force the person to sell services to the government to exchange for currency, which is then used. So the government has to spend to provide them with the currency so they can pay the tax. But if you do the double entry of that, it is the imposition of the tax which comes first in double entry terms, creating an asset for the government, a liability for the individual, which they can't pay. And therefore, actually, MMT's fundamental precept of spend comes before tax doesn't even work in their creation mythology. So I'm actually asking the question, why do we need a creation mythology narrative for MMT? Why don't we just accept that MMT describes the behavior of tax inside a modern fiat currency economy where certain preconditions apply? A central bank, you issue your own currency, you can borrow in that currency.
Why does it have to have a tax component to it? I mean, instead of just money creation, right? Like, why? You're saying they go hand in hand. You can't talk about money creation from the government unless you talk about tax.
I say you can't, no, because otherwise you have an excessive money supply. So to control inflation, and certainly Stephanie Kelton would, I think, agree with this line. I mean, there's about 250 references to inflation in the deficit myth, and they mostly refer to the use of taxation to control or to reclaim the money the government has created to control inflation. And I think the two are intimately related. As I say, what excites me theoretically as somebody interested in tax policy is that liberates money not to be a funder of government spending, because of course I don't think it is. I do buy that idea, it isn't. But it is instead a mechanism for implementing government policy. That was actually literally in 2015, you're not going to show it again, but in The Joy of Tax, wherever I can get it up, that was the whole what The Joy of Tax was. Tax has this power to be the implementer of government social policy. So I'm trying to actually move the narrative into what you might call a practical application narrative rather than getting too obsessed about the origin of money. I don't actually think also MMT's thought that through. I think somebody like Claire Dessin has got to a much better description of how money has gone through various stages of morphing. Michael Hudson might have done that better as well. I don't think MMT has recognized the literature and the thinking outside its rather narrow starting founder's point of view on the nature of money.
Let's bring on Steve and get him kind of in the dynamic of this conversation, because it's pretty interesting. Steve, I'll bring you on here. You're on, Steve. What do you think?
Okay, well, the first thing I've got to say here, and I think Richard will agree with me, you've got to take our hats off to MMT because they've made a non-orthodox approach to economics part of the mainstream discourse. None of us have achieved it. You've done some stuff with the Green New Deal. I agree with that too. But in terms of actually becoming part of a public debate, hats off to them. They've achieved things which nobody's done since Keynes. So that is absolutely essential. The second hats off is that they're absolutely correct about the nature of the financial system in the terms of the government's role in creating money. And the government deficit creates money. And that's one thing which they have pushed. And they're absolutely correct on that front. So they've got two absolute home runs, in using a baseball analogy, maybe hitting a six out of the park and being correct on that front. And that's vital. That has meant that as a result of that, I'm slightly hesitant to attack them on areas where they don't make sense. And that is the issue you've raised about the attitude that the government there's such a thing as a full employment state for the economy before the government taxes to cause unemployment. Now, and the other one about the exports are a cost and imports are a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this means we have, I make a distinction between where MMT is correctly describing the real world and where people in MMT have got the year of the elephant and think that explains the entire elephant. If you know the blind men of Hindustan, 7 men of Hindustan, all blind, go and grab an elephant, and one grabs the trunk, another grabs the tail, somebody else grabs the body, et cetera, and they're all adamant that the elephant is a brick wall, or it's a pillar, or it's a snake, or it's a fan, et cetera. And frankly, there's a lot of that. So Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler are the sources of those two. Bill is the one who's the source of the government creates unemployment. Without government, there'd be full employment. That is frankly nonsense. Okay, it's Say's law, as you say, and it's not the only perspective one can have. The perspective one can have about the role of the government is just, as Minsky used to say, to stabilize an unstable economy. But Bill's got this attitude that it's the government creates unemployment to then enable to do public purposes. And from my point of view, this is actually an Austrian economist's wet dream to have somebody in MMT saying something like that. So I'm critical of it. I'm happy to say I'm critical here. This is my show, and I'll do it. And I'm glad to have you on the same front. And equally, the exports are a cost, imports are a benefit. That is a trader's perspective on the advantage of having the reserve currency or national currency. And if they were serious about it, then what they would be saying, if you were genuinely doing like real economics about that, if that was actually, if you believed it and it was true, then what you'd be putting forward policies to constrain countries from having too large a deficit.
Yep.
Which is the opposite, of course, of what Keynes was doing. Keynes was saying you wanted to constrain economies from having too large a surplus, a trade surplus. That was the idea of the Bancor structure. So there's MMT, which is, I think, 100% correct about the nature of government money creation, the need for double entry bookkeeping, and so on. And there are ideas the founders of MMT themselves have had that I think are completely wrong. But it's very, very hard. If you attack that, then a lot of people in MMT also attack you.
Can I come back on you there for a second?
No, we'll get back to you, Richard. I want to get Mike in the conversation too, and just get his opinion, and then we'll go back to Richard. Mike, what do you think about this?
Lots been said. I do agree with Steve that we really do have to take our hats off to the MMT folks for providing, for the first time in my professional life anyway, an explanation for why a fiat currency has value. So I never was comfortable with all of the previous explanations I had heard. And that's what really attracted me to it in the first place, was like, wow, somebody's actually figured it out. And then how did they figure it out? It's been said before, modern monetary theory is not modern. It goes back a long way. And it's not theory. It's mostly a mechanical description of how the system operates. So I guess when you talk about, well, why does inflation happen? Or why do any of these things occur that's been discussed here? It's like you've got to, let's say, use Minsky, and you've got to map out, you've got to model what is happening. Get out from behind your desk, find out what's going on, talk to people, and map it out. And then then let the machine mercilessly trace through the implications of what you've laid out, the structure of the system. And when you do that, it's really hard to object. To say, okay, where have I got it wrong? What part of this, what sector, subsector have I made a mistake? Oh, over here, let's discuss this. You're saying that it's not a debit and a credit here? If I got that wrong, okay, let's fix it. If you don't object, when I press the go button here on the Minsky, it's going to mercilessly trace through the implications of that, right? And I think that's how you ultimately resolve some of these things. And, whether Bill Mitchell's talking about, unemployment is being created by the government and all that it's like, okay, let's map it out. Let's model it. Let's make sure that we got everything you're claiming represented here. Let's make sure there's nothing weird or, factually incorrect. And let's run some simulations and let's see who's right.
Richard, expand on that.
Well, I think actually I agree very heavily with what Mike just said, and I've actually done that stuff. And in a sense, this is why I agree with Steve. Look, I put out an explanation what I understand MMT to be, and there are the core bits, and you can call those 5 or 6 or 7 understandings, which are fundamental building blocks, which I think are absolutely, and I'd agree with Steve entirely. They're amazing that they've managed to put these ideas forward. And I think that anybody who subscribes to MMT should be able to agree around those issues. I hope so. But then there are the consequences. And the consequences and the interpretations will differ because people have different political perspectives, people have different understandings, and sometimes, frankly, they have different misunderstandings. We actually do have those problems. And there are quite a lot of these issues which do, and this is where I agree with you, Mike, the modeling isn't always that great. For example, there's the claim that tax can only be paid in the government-created money. Well, hang on a minute. Government-created money does not go into the private sector economy. Gets stuck in central bank reserve accounts. And so we have base money, electronic base money is stuck within that system. So actually tax is always paid in commercial bank created money. Okay, it's created as a consequence of the interaction of a central bank reserve account and an instruction from government. But when you begin to do the double entry, you see that actually this claim that tax can only be paid in government created money is actually not true. Commercial bank created money can be used to create it. And savings can be in something other than government created money. The idea that the deficit is only arising and savings are only arising because the government has injected money into the economy is not true, because clearly there can be a surplus generated in the private sector economy as well, which is reflected in commercial bank money. So we have to understand that. Now, you've just got to get the double entry right to understand that. And when I sat down and started to do the double entry of central bank reserve accounting and how it actually all works, I tell you, it was one of the most difficult bits of double entry I've ever done. And hats off to Steve for modeling this, because it is flipping hard, to put it politely. And I think I'm pretty darn good at double entry. I can talk most of life in double entry terms, and this one challenged me. So that's really important to understand that, and that's why I also think tax is so important. What I think what we need to do about MMT, and this is really my point, is we don't need to get hung up with this argument tax creates unemployment. We don't need to get hung up with the idea that inflation is created purely by the government not spending enough to overpaying or underpaying for the benefit of buying services from the private sector. That isn't what the issue is. Let's stick to the core issues. How does money behave in a fiat money economy? And it's only in certain fiat currency economies that it can do that anyway. That to me is the critical thing. And that changes our whole narrative. But even about government saving, for example, it's always said by MMT people, and I just want to emphasize this is the last point. The government never needs to borrow. No, the government doesn't need to borrow. But that doesn't mean that the government doesn't need to provide a savings facility to people who want to put deposit with the one person who's guaranteed to be able to repay them, which is the government. It's a fundamentally a different approach to thinking about what are gilts, what are treasuries, whatever they are in our own currencies, what are government bonds, and what are government saving facilities. And if we liberate ourselves from the idea that this is not there to balance the funding cycle of a government, but is instead the provision of effectively a guaranteed banking facility, then we ask, what the hell do we do with this capital? And we turn the idea of the deficit from being a deficit into actually being the national capital available for reuse as literally S equals I again. Can we reestablish the relationship?
Yeah.
And to me, that's liberating. And this is why I find MMT exciting, because it liberates me to think about those things in different ways. What I don't want to get hung up with, and which, as Steve rightly said, sometimes you get, frankly, a real jump on, which happened to me when I dared to challenge Warren on his paper, from people who say, you can't do that. Well, actually, and Stephen Hale said this from Australia, and he was really wise about this. I mean, I don't think Stephen necessarily agrees with me, but he said, if MMT isn't capable of withstanding criticism, debate, and discussion, it won't go forward. And all I've tried to do is raise some issues, and I may well have got some of them wrong. I mean, I'm completely honest that I make mistakes, and I will go back and change my own mind. And say, no, that one needs reform. But I think this debate is valuable because we need to decide what's core MMT, what does it liberate us to think about, where we can disagree on interpretation. And they are different issues.
Yeah, and that's the point. I mean, the fundamental accounting is 100% correct. Like on that point about can you pay taxes with privately created money? Yes, you can, but the actual transaction, of course, involves reserves going down.
Of course.
Okay, and so that like I've just actually seen the Australian there's Australian mainstream economist they're being the government's running a surplus bullshit, and the reason the government's running a surplus is because there's been a huge boost in the terms of trade. Prices of raw materials have gone up. Australia's a raw commodity exporter. The tax revenue has gone up as a result of that, and therefore you've now got the government spending less than it's taxing, which of course is a stupid idea in general, because what that means is the government's destroying fiat money. So what I've just in the post I've just put up on my own Patreon and Substack blogs, I said I'm not going to call it a deficit anymore. I'm going to call it a fiat.
Yeah,
it's not a deficit; it's a fiat. So if the government is running, and so that's one way.
I really agree with it. It's a very good post.
Yeah,
I've got.
Yep.
Sorry, Steve. Okay, I've got to cut in here. I'm going to bring this up. In no way are we trying to say MMT is a cult. Are we trying to strawman it? We're trying to engage in a debate to take the paradigm further. And I think what both Steve and Richard and Mike would probably agree, along with Daniel, is there has to be a healthy space where we can have debates on some of the propositions that MMT makes to take it further into the future. This is the same problem that Steve has with neoclassical economics being stuck in a paradigm and stuck in an endless thought pattern that's carried on generation after generation, and nobody's allowed to challenge it. We don't want to do that on the heterodox side of things. We want to be able to debate within ourselves so we can take the paradigm as a whole, heterodox, post-Keynesian, MMT. We want to take it further. We want to get it out into the general public, and that requires civil debate. And the civil debate does not equal bad faith. It does not equal straw manning, and it does not equal that if we challenge a proposition by MMT that we are insinuating it's a cult, because it's not. As Richard and Steve have both said, it's one of the greatest things for post-Keynesian heterodox economists in the last 100 years. Steve, I'll let you carry on.
Okay, and on this, the Ann and the Pitts comments here, it is said by two leading members of MMT that government taxation creates unemployment. Without government taxation, there'd be full employment. I'm going to criticize that because I think it's nonsense. Okay, and equally saying that the trade deficit is an advantage and the trade surplus is a negative. I think that's empirically nonsense, and it's the opposite of what Keynes argued. So I'm very happy to fully 100% support MMT on the analysis of government money creation. I've added in the capacity to model the credit system as well, and of course my Minsky software enables you to do both very fluently. But why on earth do people put forward the argument that government creates unemployment by running tax? That, I think, is just a bad argument. Now, and equally, I think the argument that exports are a cost, imports are a benefit is another bad argument. Now, I'm not going to be said that I'm. What I want to know is, why am I criticized for saying it's a bad argument? Prove me wrong, okay? And I'm going to. I haven't actually put the time into proving my own argument correct on that front. Because I'm too busy on ecological work these days. But there are parts of MMT which I say that is wrong. Now, I did say that once. I had an argument with Warren Mosler on that particular front, and this is cult behaviour here, and I'm going to defend myself on this front. I had a presentation to make at the Labour Fringe Conference, where I had a large group of people who are going to support me, and when Murphy doesn't do ad hominem. I'm sorry. That's Richard's a decent bloke too, and I think it's silly to say we're being calling people of cultists. But when I had the argument with Warren, I went from having a dozen or 24 people supporting me for the Fringe to one person. Okay? And the Fringe, I still had my presentation, but not to people from MMT. That is, to me, is cult behaviour. I criticise Warren. People didn't turn up to the meeting. That's silly. Okay, let's just have reasonable debate. And let's do it. And this is exactly what we try to do, as Lana's saying here. It's a friendly discussion. Don't accuse us of being cultists. We're saying there's some things which we should be criticising in MMT, but fundamentally, it's absolutely correct about domestic money creation. But there are then elements that come in with that which aren't necessarily what will ultimately be regarded as MMT. I think that is poor arguments about the nature of the stability of a complex economy on the one hand, and the role of export surpluses on the other.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to reinforce a couple of points that Richard made because I thought they were spot on. The first is that he used the term, liberating your thinking. And I think this is absolutely imperative for economics going forward, for modern monetary theory and so forth. And Keynes himself talked about how difficult it was for him to liberate his thinking from Pigou and Marshall and what have you, right? You're taught a certain way and you're rewarded for doing things a certain way. And now you have to think differently. And, it's the old paradox of thrift, the fallacy of composition. If you got to balance your budget at your house and I have to at my house, damn it, the government should balance its budget as well. Humans think that way, but you got to break free, at least be open-minded to just tap the brakes, hear me out and listen. Let me, see if I can open your mind to something, right? Number one. Number two, absolutely what Richard said was, the idea that neoclassical theory is the law of the land and it can't be challenged is ridiculous. It's not scientific, right? But then if modern monetary theory says, no, we're the law of the land, it can't be criticized or challenged, that's equally terrible. Mm-hmm. What we need to do, though, in addition to civil discourse, right, which in much of the world is sorely lacking, but I think here we make a pretty good effort at hearing each other, is when there is a disagreement, let's find out where we agree and where we don't. And then let's investigate where we don't agree. And let's try and resolve it collegially. Now, I would do it, and I'm going to venture, I guess, that Steve would agree with me, is that we would do that via modeling. We would say, let's map it out, and let's find out 90% of the model will agree. The 10% where we don't, we have two options. Do more research and figure it out, or run the model both ways. But the way you think it should be and the way I think, a lot of times it doesn't matter. That's not the leverage point. But having an agreed upon way of resolving civilly and collegially conflict, but being open to challenges. That's how the theory of modern monetary theory is going to grow and how economics is going to grow.
Yeah, it comes down to a methodology approach because there is an extent to which humans are religious. Okay, this is a generic explanation, and I can actually quote Max Planck on that front. The person who gave us quantum mechanics said he tried to convince his Maxwellian friends that the quantum explanation made sense because the only way to resolve the black body radiation problem. He said he could not convince one of them. He said the way that science progresses, unfortunately, is that the believers in the old theory die and new ones come along and take their place. Right. Now, economics is worse on that front because the old people, the anomalies that dispute the paradigm don't continue on. The Great Depression happens and you can't reproduce the Great Depression to check different theories against it. So it means we're even more susceptible to the getting locked in a belief system. And that makes it, I think, especially important that we do what you said, Mike, is when we have a disagreement, we first of all work out a fundamentally correct idea, which is what we've done, what modern monetary theory has done. And Richard and myself and you and Ty and Daniel are all saying 100% completely correct, no dispute whatsoever. But there are some other things that have come along for the ride, and we're challenging those. And we should do that in a civil way and be able to then resolve it. And I'm very confident that if I sat down, if I gave myself the week or two it'd take to work through the exports are a cost, imports are a benefit thing, I'd destroy that particular proposition. I can equally see that I'd destroy the proposition that a capitalist economy is stable and reaches full employment equilibrium in the absence of government. Okay? So those are two, I'd be happy to destroy both those ideas and then come with an MMT that says, and the role of the government is to stabilize an unstable economy. Yeah. And that's what Minsky's proposition. And that we should be trying to restrain countries from running large export surpluses because that gives them an investment advantage over others. That's my perspective on that particular point. So I think we'd improve MMT drastically to get rid of those two frippery ideas that have come along for the ride. But the fundamental core, we're absolutely maintaining as a correct vision of a monetary capitalist economy.
Can I come in with a quick one here and explain why I raised these points? Because I think that's quite important. You know, I've blogged now for 3-4 times a day. I mean, bizarrely, for 17 years.
You are a masochist, mate, as well as a sadist.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I've normally written 3 blogs before breakfast. That really is crazy. And I wake up and I mean, some of them aren't very heavy and some of them are. But the point, why do I do that? And why do I also write some of the incredibly long Twitter threads, which are the reason why I have so many Twitter followers, it seems, some of which I put together in a book called Money for Nothing and My Tweets for Free. Which quite clearly, some of you recognize the origin of that title. I'm quite good at thinking.
That's dire.
So look, it's a free download if anybody wants it. You can buy a hard copy if you want, but I don't make profit out of that either. The point is, why do I do this? Why do I actually put myself in the firing line? First of all, it's largely because I don't always know the answer.
Yes.
And actually, I'm brave enough to think out loud and to admit I can get it wrong. But I actually will share with people that thinking process.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I've criticized Warren, I put out a paper which goes through step by step by step by step by step why I think I've arrived at a different conclusion. I didn't say he's wrong. I actually put out, and I think it goes from A to something like R or S. So there's a 20-stage process or something. This is my thought process. Now, you can take any one of those and say I'm wrong, and then does the rest follow? Now, my point is that is actually thinking out loud. And I also encourage intelligent commentary. Over 17 years, I've tried to provide a space where people can come onto my blog and comment. Anybody who comes on and is abusive, they never get the light of day. They just get bland. I read every comment, which is really sad. There's no comment that goes up without me reading it. I moderate the lot because I want to provide a safe place for the discussion of these ideas because I think they're so important. But
Richard, can I just add? I've looked at how you post your comments, and you're actually quite fair. You have posted people that have objected to some of your reasoning, and you're still fairly. And I was quite happy to see that actually, and that told me something about you personally. So I will add that Richard does post the disagreeable comments. Now, obviously, if they're abusive, I wouldn't post them either. But I just want to point that out. That's something I've observed.
You know, I put up one this afternoon. I had to say, I don't know why I'm posting this because I don't even know what it adds to debate. But you clearly believe it, so I'm going to put it up there. I didn't agree with a word of it. It was complete nonsense. He was all talking about zombie companies, pure Austrian nonsense as far as I could see, and constructive chaos and all that rubbish. Look, I didn't believe it, but I let the person on because they presented an argument. Now, that's my point. I wanted to create the space where we can try to take the ideas forward. And I do that, and I can be robust. I'm not the only person in this tonight who can be robust, I suspect. The point I'm saying is, yeah, I can be robust because you've got to be able to do that for 17 years. If I hadn't got a thick skin, I couldn't have survived doing this. But my point is, I can be wrong, I can be persuaded, and I want the debate. And Warren has come back to me and said, look, he'll have a conversation. I want that conversation in public because I think that would be much more useful than in private. And we can discuss these issues because we need to get some of the things out in the open. And that's why I do it. And, you know, there's a cost to doing this sometimes. I mean, my wife says to me, you walk around doubting yourself all the time. And I said, if you write a blog, that's what you do. Because somebody's told you all day, every day, you're wrong. And they do all day, every day. I'm told I'm wrong. And I doubt it. And I go back and I ask the questions. And sometimes, you know, but that is really, and this is the process you're talking about, Mike. This is how we develop ideas. We have to doubt and ask and question and model and go again. And that's it.
And Descartes would maintain that's how we know we're alive.
Yeah, he would. And from that, the whole of the Enlightenment developed, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Richard, I'm going to ask a little technical question. Have you used Minsky yet?
No, I haven't. And that's
okay, I've got to twist your arm. Okay.
No, I really should, Steve. And the reason why I should is I think A, it'll help me, and B, actually, I just have not had the time to invest in learning how to use Minsky, which I think I've decided there's a big learning curve, which I suspect is not true.
It's very small. In fact, if you went for the double entry bookkeeping side, the Godly tables we call them, you'd know exactly what to do. I don't think you'd even need to look at the screen, let alone a manual.
Right.
Because it's assets, liabilities, and equity. We use plus and minus rather than debit and credit, but you can actually put in debit and credit. If you want to use that, you can use debit and credit instead. And the tables are interactive. You'll see a little wedge when you have in each of the assets and liabilities. And you click on the wedge, that'll show any assets which haven't been allocated as liability on another table. Interacting tables are quite possible. Ty has done table. What you've done is modeled 6 different Godly tables and about 20 or so. Here we go. Have a look at this one, Richard.
I did see you do that, Ty. I thought that looked really quite interesting, what you're playing with there.
Yeah, so I'll just actually show the audience. We won't get into the technical dynamics, but one of the main features of Minsky is you can set up your accounting tables. We call them Godly tables after Win Godly, and set up your stocks and flows to start the model. So you've got your logic right. So right here, I have an aggregate banking system where they're buying bonds in a primary auction. So their settlement balances go down, the bonds they own go up, et cetera, et cetera. They receive interest on those bonds. Their equity goes up. They also have the liability side of the banking sector. So that is firm accounts in my account or in my model and worker accounts. And they're basically one person's liabilities going up and another's is going down. The one thing I haven't added too much here is non-financial assets. I did put one in the firm sector, which changes. That's where you don't necessarily have a corresponding liability to an asset. That's a little more technical, but you can put all your agents, and in this case, the agents are the worker sector, the firm sector. Scroll down here. I've got a treasury sector. And this is one of the problems I have with MMT vernacular, that money is deleted when it's taxed. I have a problem with that because settlement accounts go down, or the reserve accounts if you're in America. I was actually talking to Professor Rashawn, and he prefers just using settlement balances because reserve, using the word reserve kind of gives the implication that we're still using fractional reserve banking. And that is not the case. Banks can expand their private credit as much as they want, so long as they're not going into negative equity. So you can map all that. I'm going to stop sharing this and get back to the conversation here. There we go. Yeah, so
Richard,
that's...
You'd love it. Truly.
I mean, let me say, straight away, as an accountant, what you have there is what I call a modified form of 16-column analysis paper. And literally, that's what we use to prepare extended trial balances to produce entire sets of accounts on. And that is what it actually looks like. So do I feel at home just looking at those tables? Yeah, they look pretty darn familiar to me. And I should play with it, Steve. I really should. I've just had this sort of barrier thinking, have I got the time to invest? But I probably should actually have done that.
You don't have to do actual modeling, just to clarify a bit. Of course, it does simulations. It's designed as a replacement for system dynamic models like Simulink and VenSim and so on. But if you just lay out the tables, you can use it simply as an accounting structure. And then the accounting itself, as you know, will tell you a huge amount about reality anyway. Yeah. So just that side alone, you'd be flying.
No, I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. And if you don't, you owe me several beers and a large wine very soon.
It's a deal.
Well, I actually haven't told Richard that coming on the show, he's required to send out a case of beer to Mike, you, and Daniel. I haven't told him that yet.
Oh, damn.
You do know it's the ALE, that it's the AL at the, the assets, liabilities, and equities, right? So I mean, it's right in the software. The thing is I'd say, what about a challenge for Richard? Like, what would we give him in terms of homework? I mean, he's the academic. Like, what can we give him in terms of homework to do something in Minsky? I mean...
Well, I think actually do what you've just done. You see, it's very, very hard to do that table and lay out the financial flows. Do it in Minsky. See what you get. You probably find you do it about 10 times faster than you did on hand, if not 20 times faster.
Well, that's an interesting challenge to actually look at that idea, because I did it and I had to work through it. But the great advantage is that now I've done it, I I don't have to really think now about the double entry of central bank reserve accounts. My understanding, whether we call them settlement accounts, whatever we call them, all of that now, because I spent the time working through that logic in detail until I really got my head around it. I now instinctively can understand how those relationships work. And I think that is why this really pays off in terms of the understanding it provides. When somebody tells me this has happened, I'll say, oh, well, actually, it was a little more complicated than that at one level. And in the other level, I think you just need to go and check out your double entry because you'll find your claim is wrong.
Exactly.
And it's not that hard to do the double entry. And I've given you a guide. I did actually write a blog on this, and I could put a link, or if people want it, they can find me and ask me where it is. But I think that's important to actually understand those flows. And if Minsky helps people understand the flows, use it, because anything that helps you understand this, this is an idea from physics, of course. Every action has a reaction, but that is a perfectly good description of accounting as well, and it's a good description of economics, and it is something that is absolutely fundamental. If you can't work out the reaction to your action, then you haven't understood the consequence of your behavior, and this is fundamental to working about how economics really functions.
One thing I'd like your help on, Richard, is one thing Ty just mentioned a moment ago: it's non-financial assets. Because a financial asset is a claim on somebody else. So a financial asset has a matching financial liability, and therefore the sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero, which is something which comes out of Minsky's logic. And that's been very powerful. But I then, at one stage, I tried to model houses. So I was doing a bit of modeling on what causes house price dynamics to occur. So I put houses as an asset, and then I thought, hang on, for whom is a house a liability? And I realized it's not. A house is a non-financial asset. It is your asset. It's not a claim on anybody else. It's your physical asset. And therefore, it's your asset and your equity at the same time. So we've enabled that in Minsky. And I'd like to see what you think. I'd like to get your professional feedback on that particular approach. We haven't fine-tuned it yet, but we do enable you to have multiple equity columns. And then when you have multiple equity columns, if you click on the little wedge that gives you what are assets which haven't been allocated, what are liabilities that haven't been made somebody else's asset, it will also enable you to do that on the equity side. So you can make things as an asset and an equity at the same time. And that's how we handle non-financial assets.
And let me give you an off-the-cuff response to that. And it is an off-the-cuff response. But I would actually say that a house actually is a composite asset. And the composite is made up of two parts. I'm old enough, in theory, own the house that I live in. But first of all, that is made up of two components. One is the land it sits on, and one is the actual building that was constructed on that land. And so I have a two-part component to the asset, which most of us would call a house. Now, one would quite commonly be called by economics a free gift of nature. It's the land. We assume it's ours to use. Is it?
Yeah.
Or is there an externality cost associated with that, which actually has the liability risk that I will actually have spoiled and now have a custodian responsibility with that? So actually, the free gift of nature gives rise to my liability to be custodian of this land. And you might want to explore how that relationship becomes one which is actually expressed. And the other one is that we have the house itself, the bricks and mortar, which is a diminishing asset. It is actually subject to depreciation. So although there is an apparent asset, over time there's going to be a matching liability, which will, if I do nothing to this house over the next 50 years, it will be worthless. So there is inherently the liability that this house will diminish in value unless it is maintained. So there's a contingent liability, which is the cost of keeping this asset in the condition which it is currently stated. And so you might want to look at whether you can put a value on that contingency in one case and the obligation to maintain in the other case. Now, both of them would, in accounting terms, be covered by the term provision. And for those who are familiar with international accounting standards, you'll probably find that under IAS 37. I'm playing the real accountant game here. But these are long-term liabilities which you actually have to take into consideration. The one about the land is, I'm going to go back to something we talked about earlier. Where is our boundary? Because we assume we don't have an obligation for that land. I actually assume I have got an obligation for this land. And curiously, I'm talking to you from a house on a development in a perfectly ordinary 2002 built house. there is one obligation I got with this house. There's a hedge that I acquired with this house. And the hedge...
What? Huh?
Literally a hedge.
Okay.
Yeah. It's about 10 hawthorn trees, which back down the side of the house. It's not a massive house, let's be clear. I'm not living in an estate. This is just a 4-bedroom end of terrace house. But it's got this hedge, and there's an obligation to maintain that hedge because it's a historic hedge. Now, it's curious, but it's an indication of this obligation to maintain that we have to the environment around us. And that obligation actually does fall upon me as landowner here.
That's extremely useful, mate. I very much appreciate that. Because we have actually just focused it on financial assets so far. I'm also working, of course, in ecological economics and trying to talk about how we really need to completely change the nature of our economic, make ecology and the economics integrated. And that's a lot of very good ideas about that. So that's beyond what I can imagine as coding in Minsky to begin with. But you're dead right. We have to see, in that sense, what we call our asset, that non-financial asset, is actually an obligation we should be also recognizing to society and the planet, which we're not doing.
This is what I've done in this concept called sustainable cost accounting, where I try to put the cost of environmental transition onto the balance sheet. What is the cost that I can internalize into an entity to match its obligation to an external to deal with an externality to its stakeholders? So you have to really internalize the externality, and that's where you get the treatment for this in your accounting. I believe you could build that in without too much difficulty, to be honest, Steve. Very happy to discuss that with you, because it's an idea I've spent a lot of time thinking about.
I'll whack you a copy of the Minsky manual, and if you can write maybe 2 blog posts tomorrow before breakfast rather than 3, you might be able to get started.
There were 3 blog posts today, and it's a Saturday. It's really sad, and I've been out for most of the day before this happened.
Oh dear, this is get a lifetime, is it?
This has been one of the best conversations we've had on this show to date.
Yeah,
it's really. We've covered a lot of different things, and this is the thing for me, is my luck in life is that every Saturday I get to sit with some of the most elite academics on the planet, and learn myself and become a true professional armchair economist.
I'm going to have to intervene there quickly and just so Richard a bit of background you might not have got about Ty, because the way this show came about was Dan had established a thing called Climate and COVID Correlations, which was a discussion group we were having. Little chat down the side, as you can see here. Before the show, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the show, I built a model of a pandemic called a SEIRD model, S-E-I-R-D model. I imagine your wife would be familiar with those, and maybe you are too. And yes, I do consider E.O. Wilson, by the way. Anyway, this bloke called Ty put a note saying, "I've built a model of the pandemic. Would you like to see it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." Send it to my way, shrug my shoulders type thing. Well, he sent it to me, and no joke, when I saw his model, my immediate reaction, and here I'm being an Australian once more, was attack. It was incredibly sophisticated, incredibly complicated, and if you know the story of Ramanujan from mathematics, I regard Ty as my Ramanujan. So this has all grown out of that particular interaction. So it's one of those wonderful things you talk about, reacting to comments and going outside our box. Well done. Well, that's where the whole show came from there.
Great.
This is great. We're actually gonna close it out. I'll ask the 4 of you just to stick around for 2 or 3 minutes after the closing credits. To everybody that joined in and watched the show, thank you for chatting. It was great to see everybody having a conversation on the side. I know we didn't really get to a lot of questions today, but hopefully everybody got some value out of this, because this is why Steve does it, why Mike does it, Daniel does it, why people like Richard are willing to come on the show. It's just to get some information out there for the masses. And I think we did a good job this week. Yeah. So before I go, make sure you hit the like button. Helps with the algorithm. Make sure you subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keem YouTube channel. That's where we do the show on YouTube each week. That way you'll get some notifications so you don't miss the next one. Comment underneath the video. That really helps, again, with the algorithm. Positive, I haven't really figured out if positive comments versus negative comments change the algorithm. Who knows? Test it out. If you're watching on Twitter, make sure you hit the retweet button and like. And then if you do that next week, come over here. I prefer people to come here because they can chat. There's no way for me to connect a bot to Twitter to send the comments over here. So make sure you do that. Final thank you to Richard Murphy for coming on the show. I appreciate you made an extra effort in staying the second hour. I know you coordinated that with your better half potentially. And so we greatly appreciate that. So until next week, for Dan, Mike, Steve, and Richard, we'll see you again. Bye now.